the extraterrestrial fleet showed up, hovering over with. A sense of dominance. Earth, the ships were futuristic and sleek, almost indestructible. They constructed a flawless species, developed technologies a long time before, even the ability to construct a basic wheel, and they were aware of that. So with mockery of their imminent death, the aliens had been keeping an eye on people. Development throughout generations, silently amused by the rudimentary gadgets that people named technology, that they had seen the humans constructing objects out of metal and bulky plastic devices that hardly appeared to be working while they observed people. Difficulty fixing out-of-date systems from a long time ago that in some ways had been spotted with sins, but which they were unable to fully comprehend. To the contrary, it seemed absurd for aliens to have their own technology operated by human principles. Couldn't even understand the devices, that self-healing energy sources that defined the established rules of physics and propulsion mechanisms that accelerated humanity was a light in their eyes. Very different from anything that looks like a civilization that is still worthy of respect. Despite their seeming haughtiness, the aliens were ineffective at best. To learn, they had gone light years. Technology on Earth, and they were ready. In order to evaluate it closely, the aliens thought that a comprehensive analysis would support their belief that the use of human engineering was at such a humiliation, they didn't even anticipate discovering something noteworthy. After everything, they had progressed so far beyond the boundaries of the brightest minds on Earth. But all of this assurance was forced to the limit when their own starship malfunctioned during orbit in mid-air. The Earth, it was a cutting-edge vessel, intended to transport them throughout galaxies. Easily, but something went horribly wrong. An unexpected emergency in the wake of the battle with the ship could help them with the possibility of being the aliens, stuck eternally, turned to an answer they had long disregarded, requesting human assistance, but they required more than just humans. Someone capable of making things better with a talent they were unable to imagine. Someone who was not reliant on flawless technology, but might resolve issues with just inventiveness. And in their despair, they were resourceful. They made the decision to hire a human mechanic, one of the best technicians on Earth, renowned for using whatever to fix anything. The aliens had supplies at their disposal, learned about the mechanic's standing from Earth's news, but they weren't sure. How could a human being possibly know that their sophisticated systems were unable to handle? Upon the arrival of the mechanic, the aliens observed, barely hiding their annoyance. The mechanic's amusement was insignificant. Unique by their standards, with no advanced degrees, just a person, and no sophisticated equipment, using a few basic tools, and some oil-soiled pants, and a mindset that claimed that anything the aliens with its sophisticated technology anticipated. This is a humiliating failure that they couldn't have been more mistaken. Initially, the spacecraft was inspected by the mechanic using the same level of detail they would any other. There were no complex machines, schematics, or complex designs to interpret. Rather, the mechanic had to work right away using the available tools. To determine the nature of the aliens' issue anticipated a protracted procedure lasting weeks. Maybe before the person could even comprehend the problems, but it happens fast, realized the mechanic was far away before them, whereas the aliens had invested hours attempting to fix the issue. The mechanic found the root fast, cause of simple circuit to blow, yet vital in a matter of minutes. The mechanic had a strategy to remedy it. But the aliens, as the human continued, skeptics observed, with a certain level of accuracy they not anticipated from a species they seen as archaic. The mechanic's tools were simple, but the answers were. The alien systems were anything but. Yes, it was difficult, But it didn't change the Li and perfection weren't found by humans. Something that the aliens had overlooked, instead they adjusted over time, using some of the starship's components in ways that the aliens would never have imagined. It was quickly before the extraterrestrials, engineers started observing something that made them uneasy. The mechanic wasn't only repairing things while also making them better. The procedure for resolving the issue was intuitive, useful, and, most importantly, efficient. The extraterrestrials had presumed only their cutting-edge technology could resolve difficult problems. But there was a long time waiting in Apple, many years, and people were working to move forward, and so there was a long veil of mystery cast over the heaviness. And while it was being carried away by the wind of absorption in the human mind, everyone was connected by the Starship system, working remotely and more effectively than they had ever done before. Operating more effectively than before, the aliens, now perplexed, were compelled to acknowledge the unexpected. They used to be viewed as inferior. The engineering of Earth had shown itself to be the exact opposite of its greatest strength, lied in its capacity for innovation and adaptation. In the midst of difficulties, it was about conquering, not about perfection. Challenges using the available tools in that, the invaders' realization that they had miscalculated humanity as they had thought. That cutting-edge technology was the sole path to achievement, but they now realized that it was human ingenuity and inventiveness, flexibility that was actually defined as the Starship propelled and as the engineers backed up and ready to carry on with its work. The aliens on the journey gazed at the human mechanic with a fresh appreciation for the work of an alien. The aliens could feel themselves getting closer to their goal. The lesson had occasionally been obvious. The greatest solutions originate from the most unexpected locations, where the mechanic of middle-aged specialists renowned for repairing everything they encountered arrived at with just a toolkit. The Starship, with a serene assurance that there weren't grand debuts or exhibitions of knowledge, only a silent guarantee that whatever the issue, it might be resolved for the extraterrestrials. This was the first indication of what they saw as human stupidity. How could someone with such basic equipment and abilities that could perhaps cure something as sophisticated as their spacecraft, their actions didn't bother the mechanic? Aged specialist renowned for repairing everything they encountered arrived at Eason with just a toolkit, the Starship, with a serene assurance that there weren't grand debuts or exhibitions of knowledge, only a silent guarantee that whatever the issue, it might be resolved for the extraterrestrials. This was the first indication of what they saw as human stupidity. How could someone with such basic equipment and abilities that could perhaps cure something as sophisticated as their spacecraft, their actions didn't bother the mechanic? Suspicion, in fact, they didn't appear to mind. By all measures, technology wasn't a question of sophisticated instruments or theories. It was only a question of comprehension, how things operated and making use of your resources. In order to get them to work again, they had to spend their lives fixing everything from antiquated devices to advanced. No challenge was too big for the equipment. The mechanic finds the machine too complicated. It was only to solve the aliens' problems? Their skepticism only increased as they observed a set of basic tools is pulled out by the mechanic, screwdrivers, wrenches, and other hand instruments that seemed too basic for... They anticipated such a high-tech scenario. The mechanic to fumble or struggle, even to give up, but the person instead took one glance at the system panel of the spacecraft, recognized the problem, and promptly started collaborating. With focused precision, the foreigners, whose technology was dependent on perfect systems with no flaws, could barely think about what they were seeing. Their own engineers had not been able to resolve the problem in spite of all their advanced equipment, and a human being with basic instruments addressing the issue as though it was simply another typical workday. Without hesitation, the technician obtained their filthy hands, unscrewing components, reattaching cables, and creating modifications with a certain grace and assurance that didn't seem to make sense. The aliens were particularly impressed with the mechanical method, but that technology was founded on accuracy and complexity. Systems that were only comprehensible by the most sophisticated human minds were using a simple, hands-on approach. Comprehending each and every aspect of the ship's advanced elements comprehended, the fundamental ideas of designing the interactions between the parts might be used again, and how a damaged system might be recovered without depending on the extraterrestrial engineers had perfection. Worked for hours trying to fix the malfunctioning starships, employing their advanced ideas and instruments, but all to Charlotte's effectiveness. They hadn't been in vain, had not turned on, and the aliens were running out of things to do. Since sophisticated technology was infallible, how could they be trapped in this situation? They had failed to see something important. The greatest solutions weren't always the most difficult ones. It didn't require want for the mechanic to understand the fundamental problem with the starship's main power. The system was simply blown and damaged. This was a detail in the alien circuit that required significant technology to correct. Equipment and expertise, but some mechanics had a different perspective on it. Swift modifications, they got around the broken circuit and partially repaired. There was no requirement for power to the ship. Sophisticated technology or a thorough comprehension of the mechanic comprehended alien systems, sufficient to understand how to get around this issue that the aliens observed in shocked quiet while the person worked on utilizing the starship's spare parts and basic engineering concepts to create the required fixes for what had previously been impossible to fix a starship. It seems difficult to fix a starship using the crude tools of Earth was now a problem. In actuality, the ship systems gradually but compellingly failed to keep up with their conservators. They had to clyball, the aliens didn't understand and died of starvation, and the ship system's gradually but compelling fate of the contract to ensure human engineering wasn't quite as bad as they believed. It worked particularly well in ways that had never given the mechanic much thought. Pause to gloat or explain their approach. Regarding their abilities, they weren't required to. The piece was self-explanatory at every stage. The wrench, reconnecting each wire, and each restored system sent a clear message the mechanic was aware of. They didn't have to be flawless. Technology to address an issue, they just required critical thinking skills and make use of what was available when the ship's repairs were almost finished. Systems were operating more efficiently than prior to the aliens having long since let up their uncertainties after learning they had completely miscalculated human engineering the institution to meet their needs. The mechanic wasn't merely mending a damaged system that they were demonstrating to the aliens, a fresh perspective on technology that was not dependent on perfection, but rather on pragmatics and the capacity to adapt to hardship by improvising. For when the aliens first glimpsed the importance of human engineering, rather than the search for ideal technologies, but the adaptability, creativity, and perseverance. Their dependence on flawlessness has maintained preventing people from appreciating the splendor of imperfections, and the resulting creativity due to need, what they had disregarded, considered unrefined and ineffective, was actually a strength that people could use to tackle issues on the fly, fixes malfunctioning systems with limited resources, and manage to make things work by the time the others had given up. When the mechanic was done, the starship was prepared. Although it wasn't flawless, it was operational, just as the extraterrestrials got about to leave with a renewed sense of appreciation for Eront. They had arrived on Earth with human ingenuity to disparage the technology of humanity, but in the end, they had gained important knowledge. Occasionally, the most straightforward solutions are the greatest, and in an ideal world, there is still a lot to learn about technology. said for a mechanic's inventiveness with a toolkit and the determination to create. The mechanic is set up to work. Without a doubt, there was no requirement for complex computations or advanced technology devices, simply a constant concentration on the issue at hand. The extraterrestrial engineers looked on in shock. As the person passed through with ease, the systems of the spacecraft navigating the broken parts with a cool precision that, given the task's difficulty, it was evident that although the aliens depended on their faultless advanced systems, the perfection was not necessary for the mechanic to obtain the task completed. Ingenuity was all that was required, and the capacity to think creatively. In a matter of minutes, the mechanic had determined the issue's origin, a blown circuit in the power system of the spacecraft system, which was crucial to the aliens. Failing that was only fixable using cutting-edge technology and years of certain expertise. But the mechanic wasn't intimidated by the size of the problem. They evaluated the demand circuit, evaluated the resources at hand, and established the solution for themselves. The mechanic didn't need to know in order to work. Each and every aspect of the extraterrestrial starship systems that they were aware of, but was the way that machinery operated on a basic level. They were aware of how circuits allow power to move through systems, are linked, and how to utilize the accessible resources to go around a problem. As the extraterrestrial engineers had been utilizing advanced instruments and hypotheses to diagnose, the mechanic was depending on real-world experience rather than abstract concepts, and effectively making use of just what was at hand to make an interim solution for the broken parts. As the aliens were discovered by the mechanic, both impressed and perplexed themselves. They had long taken pride in their superior technology, with faith in the think that only their advanced knowledge of the cosmos could solve difficult problems. But there was a human utilizing simple tools and a method for resolving the issue with the sort of ingenuity they had never thought that the fix wasn't completed with fancy technology or knowledge of theory, but with the unadulterated capacity to modify the systems aboard starships started to hum back to life. It wasn't a quick solution, but every time the wrenches turned, every wire reconnected, the ship approached graduality. The mechanic didn't have complete functionality. Hurry but approach each task methodically, issue as it emerged. There was no necessity to, only a continuous strain on the solution. Utilization of expertise and abilities where the aliens had only witnessed failure. The mechanic saw only opportunities, realized that occasionally working with your strategy was the most effective one. More aliens are currently watching the repair, closely started to notice something. Perfection had never occurred to them, wasn't always required to succeed. Due to their dependence on flawless systems, prevented them from seeing that occasionally the greatest answers were found in flexibility. The greatest answers were found in flexibility. The greatest answers were found in creative thinking. The greatest answers were found in creative thinking. The greatest answers were found in creative thinking. Worried about making things function, in doing so they displayed a perspective on technology that wasn't constrained by the search for flawlessness, yet has its roots in practical solutions from the actual world. As the hours went by, the procedure of repair proceeded. The mechanic modified a number of rerouting power in certain areas of the ship via mechanisms that weren't initially created for it, and using leftover parts to get functionality back. Each action was one that the aliens had rejected as ineffective or superfluous. But as time went on, it turned into more obvious that the person was on the right. The ship's systems were starting to operate as they ought to. Power was restored. The main systems were reactivated, and the propulsion system of the ship was again online. The extraterrestrials started to re-evaluate the presumptions they had devoted a great deal of time to, their excellent systems and cutting-edge technologies that they hadn't acknowledged the importance of adaptability and originality. The A mechanic had demonstrated to them that the goal of engineering was not to create the most sophisticated or flawless devices. It was about knowing how to create things function regardless of the conditions. By the time the repairs were almost finished, the aliens had discovered a useful lesson from what they had formerly disregarded as primitive and uncultured. Indeed, human ingenuity was a strength. The ability of the mechanic to improvise, to utilize whatever was accessible, had transformed what ought to have been a hopeless circumstance into a triumph in the end. The starship was completely functional, however, since it was flawless, but because it had been repaired using a combination of practical expertise, ingenuity, and knowledge and resolve that the aliens lacked option but to admit that the mechanic had done something they believed. They had fixed the ship, but it was impossible. Although Starship was far from perfect, it worked, and occasionally that was the only thing that they could do to make the aliens work. The most complicated part of this experiment was to build a thing so small that the current technical dominance realized that the use of human engineering was not to be disregarded. It had its personal assets that originated from thinking in a different way than using accessible materials, as well as from the sheer will to make the repair work, had being finished without depending on perfection in theory, but by utilizing the abilities and flexibility of an individual who might make things better regardless of the odds when the mechanic completed the final work. They had arrived on Earth in startled silence, anticipating nothing but failure, but rather they had discovered something distant, more beneficial than what the mechanic had taught, showing them that perfection wasn't necessarily. Sometimes all that mattered was the necessity. Was figuring things out in that, realizing that the aliens had spotted humans a very different perspective on engineering. What they used to ridicule, they now revered, and in doing so, they found that there might be more to the technology of Earth than they had previously envisioned. The aliens as being steadfast in their sense of superiority was discovered. Oneself reassessing their premises as the repairs developed. What they had written off as impolite and simple techniques were demonstrating not only efficient but successful in their first reluctantness took the place of skepticism. As the human mechanism achieved what they set out to do with all of their modern technology had not been able to, it was disturbing to realize that it wasn't only the ability demonstrated, but the fundamental ideas that motivate people, strategy that questioned everything, the belief of aliens in engineering, and the aliens had been solving problems for centuries, had functioned with the assumption that accuracy and flawlessness were the signs of advancement. In technology, their systems intended functionality flawlessly, leaving less opportunity for mistakes, or this precise rigidity was what improvisation was. They realized now that it had abandoned them, stuck when their flawless systems failed because they were not adaptable enough to problems for centuries. Had functioned with the assumption that accuracy and flawlessness were the signs of advancement in technology. Their systems intended functionality flawlessly, leaving less opportunity for mistakes or improvising. This precise rigidity was what improvisation was. They realized now that it had abandoned them, stuck when their flawless systems failed because they were not adaptable enough to adjust. In contrast to human techniques were constructed using the basis of flexibility, ingenuity, and the realizing that there was no system. The mechanics' method was faultless. They didn't look at the starship systems as foreign or unintelligible. Instead, they observed devices controlled by universal concepts of energy flow in circuits and mechanical exchanges, in which the extraterrestrials had witnessed intricacy beyond repair. The mechanic found issues that could be resolved through creativity, this capacity to facilitate. The key was to simplify and take decisive action, separating them for all the complexity of extraterrestrial technology that was devoid of resilience derived from comprehension failure and the process of overcoming it. As the aliens watched, they started to identify a trend in their own actions, that they had so strongly depended on their supremacy and technology, that they had become accustomed to their systems. And yes, they are advanced, but their reliance on they were brittle because of their perfection. They had never had to acquire the abilities to overcome obstacles or discover non-traditional solutions due of their. When technology did malfunction, it was rarely as sophisticated as it does now. With technology competing with the weaponry at their disposal, this was revealed through the mechanics' efforts. Fragility compelled them to face the boundaries of their repair strategy. The procedure wasn't merely technical accomplishment, it served as a lesson in viewpoint, the mechanics' capacity to adjust to a new system, to reuse parts, and to find solutions, issues without the best circumstances, to a way of thinking that the aliens had not considered. It was more than just resources and tools. It was about adopting a new perspective on the aliens. The Klingon aliens started to realize that this was where the real strength of humanity was, not in developing ideal systems, but in looking for solutions to flaws in the starship systems. Nearing complete restoration, the aliens discovered themselves struggling with a mixture of amazement and modesty. They had arrived on Earth, hoping to prove their superiority, only to discover that their presumptions were the mechanics' work flawed, brought to light a fact they had long disregarded. I kept on thinking of advancement they had started was only about developing systems, about developing the ability to address obstacles in a creative and efficient methods. For this flexibility, so foundational a fundamental aspect of human engineering, was inevitable. The aliens now perceived it as crucial. The last phases of the restoration were finished. Using the same systematic process that he had characterized the whole procedure, the Starship systems were operational. Its electricity has been restored, and it's returning to the mechanics' website. The job wasn't magnificent or flawless, but it was functional. And that was sufficient for everyone. Their dependence on cutting-edge technologies, the aliens had discovered that occasionally. Functionality was more crucial than perfection. In the wake of the repair, the extraterrestrials were given a deep regard for the mechanics of their own machines. The inventiveness, which they had before derided as primitive, now shone itself as a strength. Humans' capacity for improvised thought critically under duress and to resolve issues with scarce resources they had never placed any importance on it, but suddenly admired it greatly. It was a humble experience, but one that improved them as a result of it. Repair was more than just a technological triumph. It was a time of change when the aliens had discovered that their perception of technology that is based on the goal of they realized that perfection was not yet complete, realized that flexibility and inventiveness and fortitude were equally crucial. The mechanic had demonstrated to them that progress wasn't about getting rid of failing, but about developing the ability to flourish in its existence. It served as an instruction that would influence how they used technology and cooperation for the aliens' future, left with their spacecraft fixed. However, they took with them more than just useful methods, that they brought with them a fresh understanding of the human ingenuity in creating what they had already been written out as substandard, demonstrated to be a priceless asset in any profession in their pursuit of perfection. They disregarded the influence of flaws in flexibility, inventiveness, and tenacity, and upon realizing this, they discovered not simply human decency, but a renewed understanding of what it meant to progress as the Starship's power systems up and return to the human. The mechanics stepped aside from their work. Finished, the ship was operational after, however, it would never be as immaculate as it was prior to the issue. But that wasn't the purpose. It was productive because of a hands-on resourcefulness with which the aliens, never taken into account for all of their advances, technology that the aliens were now aware of, that there were boundaries to perfection, and they had failed to pursue it. Something essential is the capacity for adaptation and resolve issues when confronted with. The mechanic's success wasn't a failure, outcome of possessing the most cutting-edge instruments or understanding. It wasn't about adhering to an ideal design or depending on the faultless system. Instead, focused on being aware of the basic ideas, being resourceful in the way things were conducted in a crisis, and with the imagination to making everything work when it's optimal. There were no answers for the aliens, had been oblivious to their fixation on flawlessness. So enmeshed in their own technology, they were blind to the flexibility in human mechanics, had however worked with what they had discovered, the answer, and secured the position. Completed, the extraterrestrials had thought that their advanced systems that were flawless were the design of their ships was crucial to their success. To operate their machinery error-free, constructed with such accuracy that the concept of failure was almost unthinkable. However, when failure occurred, their technology was not ready for all of its complexity. It was not adaptable enough to manage the unforeseen mechanic on the opposing ship system. Instead, they had leveraged the tools of foraging to prepare whatever foods they could capture. They rocketed down the river together, and the opposing starships issue without ideal technology, but with useful, the ship's knowledge and inventiveness weren't properly displayed become all of their destruction. Of human deficiency had rapidly turned into a lesson on fortitude and adaptability of the newly arrival aliens. To examine human technology with contempt, find themselves reconsidering all of their beliefs on advancement. They believed perfection to be the final objective, but the mechanic had demonstrated destiny. They believed that flaws were frequently the key. Perfection was perfect for success, but when, unfortunately, it was the capacity to adapt to work and make decisions quickly. With what was important and accessible, the majority, by the time the fixes were finished, the ship was prepared to depart. Completely functional, but unquestionably Homo sapien, the extraterrestrial engineers were unusual, observed the complete procedure. Their respect took the place of skepticism regarding what had once appeared to be an easy task for them, and with the correct tools, a straightforward remedy had become they had a difficult task. Undervalued the inventiveness of people, thinking that the only thing they had was their own perfection, method of problem solving, but the mechanic had shown them to be mistaken about the actual measure. Your technology wasn't the key to success. It was the way you applied it when didn't proceed according to plan. The mechanic, with very simple tools and a sturdy knowledge of mechanical concepts, had resolved the issue that had been preventing hours, what had taken the aliens days to determine, had been covered in. Only a few hours later, the mechanic was better at what they did, which was more adaptable. They saw the necessity to think critically and improvise under pressure and to come up with solutions when the best resources weren't accessible, because the spacecraft ready to depart the orbit of the Earth, the aliens brought more than just, they brought a new starship that had been repaired. A comprehension of engineering, one that appreciate originality, adaptability, and their capacity for adaptation after being humbled by what they had previously ridiculed. The lesson they learned about human ingenuity wasn't limited to fixing a pacifying powder from the Earth's mostly warren place. It was about how to approach the starship and figure out its logical complexity, left feeling awed and respectful. For both engineering and humans, they had discovered that there was worth in shortcomings, in flexibility, and in the capacity to resolve issues with little resources that they had previously disregarded. As unrefined and ineffective as being more efficient than they are, systems without flaws were a source of humility, insight that would alter the how they perceived issues and technology. Resolving human engineering problems in the future wasn't about reaching perfection. Rather, it was about figuring out how to make things function. Perfection's failure served as a lesson, and the extraterrestrials would always remember, as they traveled far from the Earth they were familiar with, they'd always have with them the understanding that occasionally the finest solutions are not always found in the most cutting-edge technology, but from the most imaginative and straightforward minds.